Welcome back. Now we are going to also continue with lecture reflection. So you just answered your first lecture reflection, and we'll go back now through 4 court cases, and you will do the same for the next part of the form. So the first of the 4 cases that I want to talk about is Hobson versus Hansen in 1967. And this was a case where civil rights activist Julius Hobson, who's pictured in the background of this screen, filed a class action lawsuit in federal trial court against the Board of Ed in DC and its superintendent, Carl Hansen. The suit alleged that low-income and Black students were denied equal educational opportunity as a result of the district's discriminatory practices. So including one of among the challenges practices was that there was an institution of a rigid system that assigned students to these 3 or 4 homogeneous ability group, or what they were calling tracks, and that once assigned, students had virtually no opportunity to switch tracks. So students, how they were placed in these tracks was on the basis of a single measure. So the results of a single measure, and it was a standard aptitude test that was administered when students were in early elementary schools. After students were placed in the tracks, the lowest track received substantially different and lesser education geared toward attaining lower paying or blue collar jobs, while the honors tracks prepared for college. Low income and Black students were disproportionately represented in the lowest track. So what was ruled by Circuit Judge Shelke Wright was that the tests were not actually measuring ability because they were biased. And they were biased in such a way that poor Black children would inevitably earn a lower score. And then as a result, they would be in the lower track placement. So children were being assigned tracks based on ability, but not on ability rather, but on their status. And Wright concluded that this was discriminatory under due process clause of Fifth Amendment because the lower track classes provided less educational opportunity. So this wasn't necessarily specific to the tests, but what the tests were measuring and then the result of those tests being in those tracks. A different case a little bit later, though, does specifically talk about intelligence testing. And so this is Diana versus the State Board of Ed in 1970. There was an inaccurate placement of Mexican American and Chinese American students in California, so the other side of the country, that students were placed in special ed based on the intelligence tests that were given in English. And so the outcome was that the placement was deemed inappropriate and that the evaluation must be given in a native language to ensure fair assessment. So the remedies for the Diana case was that interpreters had to be used so that the IQ testing was completed in the native language, and that these students, the Mexican and Chinese American students in special ed, did have to be retested. And if they were misplaced, they had to be assisted and helped to readjust in the general ed classes. And that good faith efforts must be made to design appropriate tests. The next case I want to point out is Park versus Pennsylvania, 1971 to 1972. So in this case, Pennsylvania state law denied students with mental retardation any education, that the state considered these students unable to profit from public school attendance. The ruling was that the courts placed the burden of proof on schools, that schools must prove that the students were uneducable or untrainable. And so now this is where we see where Brown of Board of Ed becomes directly meaningful for students with disabilities, because students cannot be deprived of equality or liberty based on any classification. So that all individuals with developmental disabilities are capable of benefiting from education, so therefore have a right to a public education, and they could not be deprived of that based on a classification. So this really was very conscious raising across the country. The next case I want to highlight is 1972 Mills versus Board of Ed. So in this case, 7 students were excluded from public schools due to their behavior and learning problems, again in DC. The school district said they didn't have enough funds to provide for special education programs. So this idea of this was the last group of students served, but they were the first cut, and it really was the discretion of the district to do that. So what this case found, by using the Civil Rights Act to really support the decision that the district was discriminating against a single class of students. And so the outcome was that the lack of funds is no excuse for failing to educate children, and that financial problems can't have a greater impact on a certain group of students, and in this case, students that were considered students with disabilities, so it can't have more of an impact on those students than any other student. And this idea that funds must be distributed equally. The last case that I want to talk about in this section is a little bit later in 1972, Larry P. versus Riles. And this goes back to the Diana case that I talked about. It was an extension of Diana, but looking not specifically at language, but at this idea that Black children made up 10% of school-age population, but 27% of students in special ed programs. So this really called into question the validation of tests as a sole indicator of ability. Just like in the Diana case, where it was native language, this is really calling into question the validity beyond language in terms of native language. So the outcome of Larry P. was that children were being inaccurately labeled as intellectually disabled or learning disabled based just on an IQ test. So this court case ruled that IQ tests were viewed as racially and culturally biased, so they cannot be used as the sole basis for placement in special education. That being said, there's still, you can still use IQ tests in conjunction with other things as basis for placement in special ed, but it cannot be the sole test that you're using. So what was determined in this case was that the civil rights were violated, that this unfairly discriminated against students from economically deprived or racial minority backgrounds, since that they were definitely finding that the IQ tests were viewed as racially and culturally biased. So I want you to take a moment now and fill out one of the lecture reflections in the Google form. Remember, you can go back if you want to preview the slides or review the slides. All of the slides are listed for you in the pre-lecture materials.